Well, to put our scripture passage in context, and by way of review, and it came to my mind, the title I used for our whole study in Colossians, which we're going to finish in about 9 months, which is kind of a record. When Christ is not the priority, it seems to me that Paul had two major big picture concerns with the church at Colossae. One was a faulty Christology, or a faulty understanding of who Christ was. And he addresses that really in chapter 1 and the first part of chapter 2 by emphasizing both the full deity of Christ, but also the embodiedness or the incarnation or the humanity of Jesus. And we think he was pushing back against a sectarian group of that area that believed that Christ was simply one of several emanations that happened between some ultimate deity and even maybe the God of the Old Testament, which they seem to not have high regard for. And having addressed that, though, in Paul, anytime your vision or understanding of Christ is faulty, it's going to lead to faulty behavior or faulty practices in the life of the church. To use terminology that we use today, Paul believed that Christian behavior was best defined by the simple concept of what we would call Christ-likeness, or union with Christ. And if you are united with Christ, then if you want to call it the litmus test of a piece of behavior is this compatible with a person, with Christ, being united with Christ, or is it incompatible? If it's incompatible, you don't do it, and if it is, then you may. And there are certain things that you especially give emphasis to, and he started with the underlying assumption in chapter 2, verse 12, that when you're baptized, you've come into this kind of union with Christ. And then he began to deal with specific issues at Colossae at the end of chapter 2. And then sort of that overview of Christ-likeness leads to certain behaviors being rejected and other behaviors being embraced in chapter 3. And in a sense, I think, the section then on wives, husbands, children, parents, slaves, masters is I'm going to call it a further focusing of that question of how do you behave in the Christian life, essentially saying, how do you behave at home? What does it mean to be Christian in your home? And the issue of wives and husbands, children and parents, slaves and masters was a fairly common subject to be treated by ancient philosophers. So much so that, let's see, what are people like secular be called? Late antiquity historians, history of late antiquity or Greco-Roman Empire historians will talk about household tables or household rules to describe the kinds of patterns of behavior. And in the secular world, the purpose was how do you maintain order? What makes the world run most smoothly was kind of their motivation. And so Paul picks up on these subjects, but I think if we simply reduce it to, this is the cultural thing of their day, we miss his point. His point is this is in the context of everything he's been saying about Christian behavior since chapter 2. And I actually have it sort of as a question, should our behavior at home be less or worse than our behavior with any other person? We would normally have certain expectations that, at least in public, you don't do these kinds of things. You don't treat people this way. And then there's lots of folks who hold that standard in public, but not at home. And so it seems to me Paul is turning the screws a little bit to say, all right, I've described in general the way Christians are to behave. Now this is how it might play out in relationships that happen in the household. By way of reminder, household as opposed to home, common Greco-Roman and actually New Testament term, household is everybody that lived under the roof. So that what we would call extended family, multi-generations family, and slaves were a part of a household. And that's why the slave's masters comes under the household description. Fascinating, seems to me. We assume there were some members of the Colossian church who were slaves, and possibly some who were masters. Possibly some who were slaves and masters in relationship with each other. All of which, as some of you know, and I'll just take a rabbit trail off to the side quickly, I hope, and get back. One of the things that impressed me coming to Kansas City, and to Kansas City first, was seeing employer-employee at headquarters, now GMC, kinds of relationships that showed more capacity to worship together, to get along together, than is often thought to be the case out in the outer lands of cynicism in the church, where there's lots of doubt about the integrity of what happens by certain church leaders and their sort of dictatorial ways, and to see church people getting along with each other was an impressive and helpful thing to me when I moved to this town. And so that is a kind of an example there. And I know it's sometimes a hard thing to manage, but a thing that even in the same household, when you worship together and then you go back to being a slave and a master at the house, that's a challenging kind of relationship. And in a sense, it strikes me interesting, he gives more attention to the slaves than to any other single group in this household table thing that he covers. The other thing we talked about last week that It came about accidentally because we didn't finish verse 17 2 weeks before, but I'm just, I'm impressed. How smart am I? To connect verse 17 to these things, these verses, rather than just making this complete break, as you see right here on the screen, verse 17, I mean, lots of white space, rules for Christian households, cross-reference, new subject matter. Don't even think of connecting verse 18 and verse 17 to each other. Maybe it's our community Bible experience reading process is pushing me against that. And so we worked with 17 as part of the context of this. And I want us to read 17 through 4:1, and we'll look at all of the household treatment here. In the context of verse 17. Marcia, do you have?
I was just going to say, I think our problem with the word slave is the only reference we have is to our country and how people were treated. But I think it was somewhat different there, where even, I mean, it was kind of hard when you say that there are slaves and masters in the same church. It's kind of hard for us to imagine that because we have another negative attitude. But I think that probably there were situations you might call them a slave, but they were, Paul talks about later about a love slave, where there were people that really got along well in the household with the master and was not treated badly. And that the fact that they would even allow them to be in the same church is kind of unusual for us. Is that true?
To a large degree, yeah. If I can be more blunt about it, for us, slavery has racial connotations. And slavery in the ancient world was not a racial issue primarily. There were plenty of slaves of the same race as the master. More than forays into Africa to capture people to be slaves, as took place in our history. The way people became slaves was primarily through debt. Or being orphaned, something
about
that.
Conquest? When they conquered different lands, they brought people as slaves.
But those are often the same race kind. We would call them same race.
You still can't get around the fact that historically, I don't care how far you go, how deep you go, and how you try to rationalize it, slavery has always been an ownership issue. And you can try to make it servitude if you want, which some people try to do. But slavery has still always been an ownership issue. And that's, to me, that's a challenging subject. And I don't see how we as humans can tolerate, whether it's fellow Christians or anybody else in history that has thought it was okay to be a master over another human being.
Okay. Your opinion on that, Carol, is partly the product of the age in which you were born.
Well, that may be
so,
true.
And so we give thanks for that, without condemning the folks in the first century who hadn't figured this all out yet.
That still may be true, but human
But
beings
what
have
you
still
said is
been
correct.
human beings.
And there are plenty of instances of violent and hateful owners, far more than in instances of kind and gentle owners.
It goes all the way back to Abraham. I mean,
It's as old as human history almost, in the second generation of human
But
history.
still, I have to emphasize and not leave it lay, that when you own something, whether it's your child, whether it's chattel of any kind, a wife, a husband, not so much husbands in this culture, but men trying to own their wives, which has been part of our history, and trying to own your kids, which has been the custody issue, or whether you talk about slavery, ownership of another human being has existed throughout most of civilization, and that is just not right.
Because it is usurping the role of God.
And that's exactly where I was thinking, is that I really do consider myself a servant and a slave, and I consider that wonderful because my boss is Christ.
Right.
And so it turns it into another way. It doesn't matter whether I was teaching or gardening or anything else. That's where it is.
Which is, I think, the direction Paul takes this. Let's read together 3:17 to 4:1. Together. Whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Wives, be subject to your husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and never treat them harshly. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is your acceptable duty in the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, or they may lose heart. Children, obey your earthly masters in everything, not only while being watched and in order to please them, but wholeheartedly, fearing the Lord. Whatever your task, put yourselves into it, as done for the Lord and not for your masters, since you know that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You serve the Lord Christ. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for whatever wrong has been done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, for you know that you also have a master in heaven. We worked on a bunch of this last week. A couple of phrases that and Dorothy was happy and I was happy that we had 53 folks. But with a third visitors, some of the dynamics of conversation seemed a little bit uncertain or strange, at least to me. So there's a few phrases I'd like to at least visit if we didn't get them covered. In verse 18, the phrase, as is fitting in the Lord. And in particular, the in the Lord piece, which seems to me to be Paul's way again of connecting all of this stuff to this larger stuff he's been working on since the beginning of chapter 3, since the middle of chapter 2. What does it mean to be family, to be husband and wife in the Lord? I'll stop there.
We all answer to the same Lord.
Okay.
You have to put self aside to a certain degree.
Can I reinterpret that a little bit to say,
A little louder.
she said you have to put self aside, and it triggered a larger framing, I think, in my mind, is that you don't regard the marriage relationship as a competition to see who's in charge,
Right.
or who gets the most points, or who's right most often, or who has the power, all those sorts of things, which unfortunately often happens in homes of people who go to church. And we'd like to call ourselves Christian homes, but it's a place where the way we were formed by probably our own parents, isn't it fascinating how the things you said, I'll never do when you're a kid, you do when you're grown up all of a sudden, because the tapes were put there, and it takes a while to realize, whoa, I'm doing what my dad did, and how do I change? And it's a hard thing to do. So to think or conceptualize our relationship in a marriage in terms of not pushing our agenda, but contextualizing, this is a relationship that happens in the Lord. And so all the guidelines of Christian behavior in general apply in specific in the home, which last week, a couple weeks back, compassion, mercy, meekness, humility, patience, and love. That should be easy in the home, shouldn't it? Why isn't it? Marcia?
It's because we relax and we just revert back to how we really are inside sometimes. You know, I mean, I think the answer to this, what you're really saying, the first question was, do unto others as you'd have them doing to you. It's the golden rule, basically.
Yeah.
But sometimes we let it slip and we just kind of get back into our own little selfish attitudes. And yes, it does play a role in how we were raised, what we thought was the role model, whether it was a right or wrong or a bad one. But I think we just kind of lax into, it's okay, I can do whatever I want because I'm home now. I don't have to be nice. I can just do whatever I feel like doing, kind of thing.
Which is most fascinating because that wasn't the way we behaved in courtship.
No, because we put on an act there too.
We were putting on a face
Our
in
best-
courtship too.
Our best behavior.
Yeah, yeah. Mike?
The rabbi that we go listen to says marriage is never about you, always about the other person, not about self.
Which is a scary sort of thing, unless what? Unless there's two people in the marriage and both of them are on that mode. Because we have this instinctive wanting to take care of ourselves. I think I said this in the sermon last week, didn't I? That who's going to look out for me? I mean, this is the question that goes back to Genesis 3 in the garden. And the only way that works is if both partners are taking care of the other. And then you don't have to take care of yourself because you know someone else is. Yeah. Carol?
A few years ago, I met a gentleman who had been addicted chemically to chemical substances, and he was in big trouble, and he went and got training, and then he ended up becoming a chemical addiction counselor. And he taught me something very profound. He said there are two words, two prepositions, that if we will honor those two prepositions in human relationships, whether we're in a home, in a relationship with our workforce, our kids, whatever, we are responsible to our kids, our wives, our husbands, our employers, whatever it is, we're responsible to them. We're responsible for ourselves. And he said that centers around one word, control. When you start getting out of the territory that applies to somebody else, it means you're trying to take control of them. And so what we do in home, it's comfortable, as Marcia says, to try to control somebody else. Whereas when you get out in the job place, you better be careful because you might get fired or whatever it may be. We do that with our kids. Kids try to do it to their parents because they haven't learned yet to be responsible for me. And that's our responsibility to teach them that. So I thought it was very profound, and I think those two prepositions, if we would all take note and literally try to stop controlling anything or everyone else, we wouldn't have near the conflict that we have.
And to put it in theological language, it's the question of who is Lord. For me. And from Genesis 3 again, sin always is the asserting lordship on my end and taking prerogative from him to take control over someone else. And generally, to not desire control of myself. We would often tend to flip the prepositions. I'm responsible to myself, but I'm responsible for someone else. And because we want to control them, but we don't want to control ourselves. Galen?
Roger, is that always true? And here's what I'm pondering. One, a teacher and a student. The teacher has to teach the student that's teaching. The student has to have a desire to learn. A parent and a child. The parent has to relay this information to the child out of love, and the child has to want to assimilate it. So I'm just pondering and saying, is that really always true? And I'm not certain that it is.
What? The control issue, or the preposition issue, or lordship issue?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure how to frame this.
There is reciprocity assumed here.
Well, what are you questioning? That's what I don't understand. What do you say that you're not sure what's true?
Well, it sounds like that doing this preposition thing, that there's never any
Pushback.
hierarchy. And I don't see hierarchy as always being bad. We talk about somebody being a control freak as if that control is always bad. And I don't see that. I think that sometimes control is both necessary and profitable for both, and I'm saying for both parties. I don't believe in control as in slavery, which is what's being discussed here, as I view it. But I'm not buying this modern language of, well, he's always a control freak, or she's always a control freak, or we're always being controlled. I think sometimes it's necessary. Take the military. I mean, it's unquestionable. There must be control. And it's not control because the person at the top of the hierarchy hates the other person. They love them. They want to make certain that they live, that they can, that they're not going to go into danger. So I'm not so certain that we can just put everything in one little frame and say, yeah, it always fits. I don't believe it does.
Well, there are circumstances that perhaps these here, I think it does. The other piece to respond to you, responsibility to someone could include the need to instruct, to model, to provide guidance,
I agree.
those kinds of things. But regardless of the relationship, ultimately you can't control another person.
I agree with that.
So I think that was probably Carol's point, and I think that's Paul's point here. I didn't necessarily receive it happily, but a commentary on the household table in 1 Peter pointed out these are commands that the writer gives to the various, there's commands to wives and to husbands and children and to parents and to slaves and to masters. And that the giving of a command always implies a choice on the part of the person listening, whether to do it or not. And so an evaluation on the part of the person that this is in my best interest to do this, or I'm willing to pay the consequences that come into my life if I don't do this. Unfortunately, some of the consequences aren't just to me, they are to other people in the relationship, or in the relationship fringe. I'll leave the military issue go, since it wasn't part of the household rules. And the early church debated for several centuries whether you could be a Christian and be in the military. and eventually came to the conclusion perhaps you could, but you better be careful. But in part that was because the Roman military was in charge of enforcing the Roman religious system too. And you had to swear allegiance to the gods of Rome, those kinds of things. Now you just have to swear allegiance to the gods of the state. Yeah.
This doesn't mention employers and employees. Is that included in slaves and masters, or is
Well,
that just something separate?
that is, I think I think the only way we can make application of the slaves and masters stuff in the text. The system of slavery that's been in existence and still is in places that's referenced here it isn't a part of our culture overtly. It, I think, is underground in some places. The whole sex trafficking kind of thing is a slave trade sort of issue. But that's, again, different than what's envisioned in this kind of context. So that employers strikes me as, if I'm going to, either I say, verses 22 to 4:1 have nothing to do with me. Or I say, this speaks words that are good principles for my employee-employer relationships. Let me, Lori?
Just as a balance on this conversation, I recall wondering, how much do you do for your employer? And the answer that came to me is, do more than what they request, because you always please them then. And the peace that comes from accomplishing and being accepted and pleasing is far higher than wondering if you have done all that you are expected to do. It takes a lot of drive to do that, because some employers are very demanding. But I have found that doing more than what they ask is by far more satisfying personally. What are you losing?
Okay.
Zero.
Well, several hours of day sometimes.
The right attitude.
Gabe?
Roger, I'll conclude by saying I think that you hit the right balance when you said the words fitting in the Lord, because whichever side of the spectrum we are on, when we do that as is, when we, so I say perform, I don't like that word, but perform in the relationship
Sure.
as is fitting in the Lord. As I've always said, if a husband and wife want to get closer together, it isn't necessarily about them trying to get closer together. It's about them trying to get closer to God and their relationship with Him, which just automatically brings us all together. So I like the phrase fitting in the Lord.
Okay. Thanks to Paul. I do want to just say a bit on the children thing. Fathers, do not provoke your children, or they may lose heart. The Greek word for provoke here describes the questioning or challenge of a child's worth in an attempt to force a certain behavior. I think we could use provoke in some kind of large blanket way to say never make your child upset, which isn't what I think Paul's saying. He's saying don't challenge a child's worth in an effort to force a certain behavior from them. Don't tell them they're worthless if they don't do X.
Don't hurt their self-esteem.
Yeah, and I'm not as big on self-esteem as most psychologists are, but the next phrase, I think, is a badly translated one by the New RSV. They may lose heart. First of all, the or is wrong. The two phrases are connected by a purpose conjunction in Greek. Do not provoke your children in order that they not. And lose heart isn't too bad. I've written the Greek just blew me away. become disheartened to the extent of losing motivation, be discouraged, lose heart, become dispirited. And I called it an alpha privative word. I was sort of late last night, so I used a technical term. I'm sorry. But a lot of Greek words exist in a negative sort of sense, with alpha being a meaning without. We call it alpha privative. You probably are most familiar with it in terms of agnostic. The A in agnostic is an alpha privative. Gnostic means to know, and agnostic is one without knowledge. And so here is the word translated by the New RSV, lose heart, and that first letter is an alpha. Oh.
When it goes to sleep, it disconnects.
Yeah. All these wonderful things I've got to learn to do again. Let's see, I want this one, I think. Okay.
It's thinking.
More than I'm doing. They've got the word athumosin, and there's the alpha at the front end. The rest of the root here is the same root as the one we had up in chapter 3 for anger. So they'll be without anger, but it's not just without anger, because I went into I'll call it the secular dictionary of Koine Greek. And it means strong feeling and passion, even life, spirit, and strength. In other words, the parent is charged to not deprive the child of passion, of spirit, of strength.
Not trodden down.
Break the spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah. My mother's phrase, you have to break their will but not break their spirit. And that's a challenging sort of thing to do. But it's a reminder that there is, I'll call it now, a spark, and the Greek word thumos is sometimes used for fire. There's a spark within every person. And you know what happens when you get yourself stomped on too often. Your spark goes out, your spirit. And so you become
Completely
just,
disillusioned.
you won't look them in the eye. You've discovered it's easier to just be passive and to say nothing and do nothing rather than to suffer the consequences of the angry parent or boss or whoever it is. And it's interesting that when a parent does that to a child, they're messing with God's creation. Now, some kids' spark is pretty fiery. And it takes a special saint, which is why we have a Mother's Day, I guess, to tolerate some of kids' fire, spark. But it struck me as an important piece there. And I didn't want us to lose that as we
Roger?
move through this. Yeah.
There's a phrase, not good enough, that is used. So much books have been written about it. Some really great people have written. I went to medical school with a man who, whenever he was young, was told by his father repeatedly, "You're not good enough to be able to get into medical school." They were very poor. Don wasn't really that smart, but he was good enough, and he proved it. But so much, there are many people, at least, in the self-image arena that believe that that's one of the most common traits that is instilled into young people as they're younger, that they never talk about, that we don't even think about, that many of us in this room feel like we're not good enough.
Yeah.
And back to your point, God's what makes us good enough.
Yeah. And when we participate in that devaluing of a child or another person, we are attacking God's creation.
Right.
It's very much like murder.
It is very much like murder, which, interestingly enough, this is the other word for anger. In Matthew chapter 5, it's being angry with your brother is the one that's equated with murder in the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah. Well, slaves and masters, I'm willing to let go. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there any way to quickly determine whether that squelching the child's spirit is related in the Greek to the term for squelching the Holy Spirit, the one unforgivable sin?
Yeah. Quench not the spirit, I think, is the phrase you have in mind, which I think that's 1 Thessalonians 5 something or other, 20 or 19 or 16 or somewhere in between 17 and 22. Well, since you asked, we can look, I guess. I don't think it's the word that's used, it's not the word used in the Gospels to describe the unforgivable sin or the sin against the Holy Spirit. But there's something similar there, and let's see. Yeah. Quench is, you put an alpha privative on the word quench and you've got asbestos.
That wouldn't work.
So in essence, the subject is still fire. So there's kind of a related conceptuality. Linguistics, I think people would put them in the same sort of concept group. Well,
19.
Verse 22, and this was a week or a lesson that I've been frustrated with the translation of the new RSV. If nobody was listening, I would say, man, it's as bad as the NIV today on this section. Paraphrasing all over the place. I at the top of the back flap, I've tried a more literal translation. Slaves, obey your masters or lords according to the flesh in all things, not in eye service as men pleasers. And it struck me, I don't know if these are made up words. They're certainly rare in Paul. That happens here and in Ephesians, the parallel sort of household table there. Eye service. Doing what you do just to be seen. I think it's the opposite of what Gloria mentioned when she called me unbalanced. When you go beyond what's expected, you're not just putting out a visible front to be seen. So this is the negative here, that you don't serve as a slave or as an employee just with a front that's to be seen so you look good or you look like you're pleasing, and with the purpose of pleasing that person, or maybe better, appeasing that person. And there's certainly employers that pleasing is impossible, appeasing is possible if you bow and scrape enough. And Paul isn't interested in that, because in essence that puts the human employer or master in receiving the attention and the energy from you that ultimately belongs to your heavenly master or Lord. But in sincerity of heart, as you fear the Lord. And then goes on, whatever your task, put yourselves into it as done for the Lord and not for your masters.
That would solve the problem at home.
It's interesting how interchangeable some of this advice is, because it's generally good relationship advice about how we get along with folks. To do 23 a little more literally. Whatever you do, work out of the soul or out of the heart, as to the Lord. Which I think helps to answer questions that were raised here. Do you try to do more than the boss wants? How do you deal with a bad boss? You respond as to the Lord, which I think means a couple of things. If you're responding as to the Lord, that means you're valuing all the fellow employees and the boss as creations of God, And it does mean that you can't play along with a boss who's putting people down and devaluing them, trashing them. You can't play along with fellow employees who put the boss down, who trash the boss, as much as, I just feel sexist all of a sudden, as he may deserve it. It could be as she may deserve it, as the boss may deserve it. And it's easy for us to get caught up in office griping, office gossip, that puts down somebody else that's not present with us. And that seems to me as not falling under doing this as to the Lord, because the Lord values those persons. Now, I suppose the Lord would be willing to recognize we could use some more help from this person. But that's a different thing than saying, what a worthless jerk this person is, or what an idiot this boss is. And so that use of pejorative language changes us from serving the Lord into being Lord ourselves in our relationships with others. Since you know that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward, you serve the Lord Christ. That kind of nails it all down there. And then Paul's optimism. For the wrongdoer will be paid back for whatever wrong has been done. And there's no partiality. Have you always worked in a place where there was no partiality?
Sure.
The seminary word for verse 25 is, this is an eschatological hope. This is the way it's going to be someday. In part, when will the wrongdoer finally be paid back? Every wrongdoer. This is the sense of Christian confidence in a final judgment, that a part of the purpose of the final judgment is to restore balances of what's right and what's wrong, and that wrongdoers will suffer the consequences of their wrongdoing. And with God, and there's no partiality. That word partiality, which is a funny word, it means face lifting. The person is bowed before you, and you, oh yeah, you, okay, you're okay. You see who they are, and then you make a decision. The most common use of this partiality in Paul is there's no partiality with God. And it's the confidence that God is the ultimate fair and just judge. Mark?
I understand what you're saying about being subject to our employers and not getting caught up in gossip and all that kind of stuff. The question I have is, there are people who are in positions of authority who command or direct people to do things that are inconsistent with what would be pleasing to the Lord. I don't think I heard you saying that this passage says that we do that anyway, and then at judgment we can say, well, I was obeying this piece, even though I knew that it was wrong. Where is the role for when a person in power, whether it be a husband or a wife or a boss or a master or whatever, to meet resistance? Or is there any resistance in this passage that is incumbent upon those who are Christian?
Doesn't that fall under as fitting in the Lord?
It might fall under fitting in the Lord. That's I think a tougher question in Paul's context than it is in ours. Since it's Mother's Day, I'll appeal to my mother to say, if the boss wants something that violates your Christian conscience, then you quit. You refuse to do it. You'll find another job. A slave could not find another slave position. He could get branded, could have a hand or a foot cut off or something of that nature. So that sense that in our culture that we say, Now is some time for some creative resistance. At least in the slave-master thing, I don't know that Paul was at a point to have conceptualized how that could have happened, other than if slave and master are both in the church, that you appeal to your life together in the church. Let me, this is, let us not forget the power of prayer. Most of us are more impatient than God in solving certain kinds of problems. But at least we ought to start with prayer in those kinds of circumstances. And that prayer ought to include a prayer for wisdom of how we respond. There are people in power and authority who, when challenged about the rightness of something, will in fact realize that, whoa, this isn't consistent with the way I was raised or trained either, and they may or may not thank you for calling them on it, but they are open to change. There are others who aren't, and in many instances, it seems to us anyway, it's primarily an ego issue. I think in our context, we have some responsibility to do creative, I'll call it resistance, but with the awareness it may mean I find another job someday. A part of that in particular has to do with standing up for people being abused, whether it's children in homes, wives sometimes in homes. And wife abuse is a really difficult thing to manage legally, but to find ways to support safe homes, things of that nature. There are a variety of ways that we can be still pursuing the agenda of Christ without necessarily stomping into the boss's office and demanding some kind of total change on that person's part.
Roger, may I share one thing quickly? Whenever I was in Vienna at the World Conference on Human Rights in the mid-90s, I was fortunate to set into some groups with multiple countries around the world. One of them in particular was Pakistan. And at that time, I don't know if the numbers have changed, there's a thing practiced in that Pakistani region called living bondage. You alluded to it earlier in the times of Paul, it's almost the same. These families are in debt to a master or a owner, and then that debt gets passed on down through generations. It's one of the largest conduits for sex abuse or exploitation that exists. I don't know if I said it, but it's estimated that maybe 20 million people or kids are involved in this process. To Mark's point, those people have no recourse. They get chained to beds at night, they work during the day, they get abused sexually at night or whatever it is, and they have no way out. And I would share the story with you that this exists today just as much as it existed with Paul. And it's part of the reasons why I'm adamant about my position with this concept. But I would appeal to you to, if you're unaware of this situation, that you become aware and do anything you can to have a voice, to maybe obviously through the power of God, but as humans, that we can to try to do something to alter that incredible atrocity that exists in that part of the world.
And there's, I'll call it space for common cause with all kinds of folks that you might not agree with on other issues to make common cause on something like this.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. Well, I want one last word so we can move on next week. Masters, treat your slaves justly. The second word should be with equality. I don't know why they chickened out and just did a synonym fairly. With equality, because you have a master in heaven. The ultimate sort of climactic point here, all of us answer to the lordship of Christ. And a part of our responsibility for ourselves. It is how we deal to our responsibilities too, because we have to answer to the Lord Christ ultimately in how we've treated our employer or employees, our children or our parents, our husband or our wife. Father, thank you for your word that pushes against us, is countercultural, and is especially counter-evil. Open our eyes to ways that we should be involved in being agents of justice and equality, ways in which we should be involved in enabling, first of all, our own treatment of every other person to be like your treatment of that person, our own attitude toward every other person to be like your attitude toward every other person. That'd probably keep most of us busy the rest of our lives. And help us to see this as something larger than, oh, this is my private matter. This is part of our life together in Christ. And it has ramifications in the church, in our households, in the church, and in the whole world. And so we ask for your presence, your guidance, your wisdom. We want to be good stewards and to acknowledge you as Lord and live with you as our Lord. We ask in Christ's name and for your sake. Amen.
Hey.
Pardon?
That's great. That's a lot of documents on it.